I'll kickstart this event. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on a Saturday morning. As John said, what else would we be doing but speak about how to tax multinationals? And I can't agree more. It's actually my favorite topic of conversation, weirdly enough. As I mentioned this morning at our event in Florence, it's probably the only topic on which my brothers and I actually agree that we do need to tax multinationals, and that the only way to do it is by coming together. So here you have it, a family consensus that rarely happens and why I like it so much. To introduce this event, every first Saturday of the month at Atlas, we host something called Unity Day. What we mean by this is we want to celebrate every month what brings us together instead of only talking about what divides us. Whenever we open the news, we read about famines, climate change, depressing events, how we fight, how we are not managing to cooperate to solve global challenges. This very topic is the proof of it. We don't manage to collaborate to actually tax some of the biggest companies of our time. We like to try to look at it from a bit of a different perspective once a month and to try to understand and imagine if we come together, what we can actually achieve. I personally think that we can unleash insane potential and that we can actually change the world by coming together. I like to believe this. And that's why once a month, we host Unity Days. We're doing it online so that people who can't access in-person events can still participate, and that we can pull on incredible speakers like the one that I'll introduce in a couple of minutes. But we're also hosting those events in person all across the world. I mentioned we just hosted it in Florence, in Italy, where I am right now. On a public square, we talked with lots of people about how to tax multinationals, different strategies on how to get there, from looking at the European Union to the G20 to holding companies accountable for their actions. Because I didn't mention it, but this Unity Day, we will talk about multinationals and how to tax them. And this afternoon, we are having events in Lisbon, Nairobi, and Delhi on this very topic in person, with speakers in some of them, and the focus will be on new participants. So we like to kickstart those conversations with a panel discussion to get inspired, to get information, and to think a bit outside of the box. But after the panel discussions, we regroup, and it's actually a group discussion brainstorming that leads, and I'll explain how and I'll guide you through it, but to conclusions for Atlas to be able to take forward. We are a global political movement. We try to impact change from our countries to the global level. And this is why talking about such topic is fundamental to be able to actually come to a consensus and campaign on it and impact change. So today, what will happen? We have an hour 51 left of this event, exactly, to be very, very precise. And I'll get started with a panel discussion that I'll introduce in a minute. And then we will, as I mentioned, put the focus on you. So Joanne here present will facilitate some icebreakers and get to know one another, games and exercises. And we'll then do our typical consultations at Atlas. So we'll walk you through identifying the main issues with the lack of taxation of multinational companies. And I know it sounds scary because it's probably not your favorite topic, or you might not have a PhD on it, but you'll see after the discussion that you actually know a lot and have a lot of ideas. Trust me for a second, you do. We'll prioritize together the issues we want to discuss. We'll come up together with solutions on how to tackle them, and we'll prioritize the solutions so that at the end of it, we have a way forward for Atlas to look at this topic, and our teams will then deep dive into the policies and create campaigns, etc. So that's the program of the day. It will take 2 hours. I'm not going to keep John and Tommaso, who hasn't joined yet, for 2 hours because it will be too long. So the panel will last until 12:45. We are a tiny bit ahead of schedule. It will actually start at 12:15. And the idea is ask me all of your questions. I'm live streaming this on Facebook. So Andrea, we have too many Andreas. Andrea Benzon will take the questions from Facebook and bring them on Zoom. Feel free to ask them as well on Zoom, and it will be quite interactive. I'll call on you if you don't want to speak, write it down, and we'll have a discussion. And I'm really, really excited. So I hope you are as well about this event. I'll introduce the panel or the topic of the panel super quickly as I'm waiting for Tommaso to join. So I'll give you in the meantime a tiny bit of background about multinationals and the current system. So, and I like to name names. It's easier for me to picture what I'm talking about. So let's take some examples of multinational companies that are not behaving in the best of ways. I'll pick Amazon because it's one of my favorite examples, and just so that it becomes a bit more concrete in your minds. Across the world, we lack a global tax system. We don't have a way of taxing multinationals across the world. I'll ask John and Tommaso later, and I'll introduce them as soon as Tommaso joins, to explain the issues with tax dodging, moving profits elsewhere, managing to not declare digital profits and so on. There's a lot of different issues that come into it. It's obviously not a simple topic. There's also the topic of tax havens and so on. But the fact of the matter is, across the world, we lose between $500 billion to $600 billion annually, so every single year, because of tax havens and tax dodging. So those are very, very big numbers. It's hard to comprehend. At least my human brain has issues in understanding what 600 billion means. With half of 500 billion, we could put an end to global hunger for 1 year. That's just to kind of help you picture it, right? With half of the money that we are losing because multinationals, because Amazon and the likes don't pay the taxes, we could end global hunger for an entire year. So that's why we're talking about this. That's because it's insane that in the first place, and I know that John will have a lot to say on how we use taxation in the first place and so on, but it's insane that our societies across the world do not reap the fruits and the benefits that multinationals should be, from the taxes that multinationals should be paying. It's something that I can't comprehend. It's something that is absolutely insane that is still the case. We all suffer because of it. Public services, poverty and so on could actually beneficiate a lot from this amount of money. And we'll talk as well during this event of how this tax dodging doesn't impact all countries the same way. So while we all lose out, obviously there are some tax havens that might benefit from it, but while we all lose out, for example, low-income countries tend to suffer even more from it. And I think it's something that John might want to speak a bit to in this panel as well. But so it really is a global topic. It's one that we cannot solve if we don't come together. And it's one that could change the face of the world in the future. So while Andrea admits people, I'm going to introduce the speakers and get started with John, and then Tommaso will join us in the conversation at some stage. For this conversation, considering the fact that I'm far from being an expert, we called on John Barry, who's a professor of green political economy. He will talk about some countries that are tax havens and as a result are stealing tax revenues from low-income countries, which is what I just mentioned. And he'll also talk, I think, a bit more about how corporations and wealthy individuals manage to evade paying their fair share of taxes. He'll focus a lot on this. Later, we will also have Tommaso Faccio, who's the head of Secretariat of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's basically an entity, a commission that looks at how to reform global taxation. So exactly what I'm talking about and exactly what I'm mentioning. His aim is to try to have a debate and discussion on how to change international tax rules. He's looking at existing forums like the G20, like the OECD, like the UN. There's actually very interesting discussions happening right now between the United Nations and the OECD, and on how we can actually create a global tax system that is in the public interest. So while we wait for Tommaso, and because I spoke enough, and as I mentioned, I'm not an expert, John, I'm going to turn to you to ask you how, in your opinion, the current tax system, or lack of, since we don't have a global tax system that actually works, operates. So what is we talk about taxing multinationals, what's the status quo right now?
Aye. Well, Majin might go there, agus díadúibh ó Éireann. Tá mé sasta a beg an seo, agus tá súla gom go bhfuil wach daoine go maith. So, hello, thank you, and good morning. And I hope everybody is doing well. That's us Gaeilge, our indigenous language here. And that's part of the discussion, I think. How do we indigenize and recoup the legitimate taxation that's owed by corporations around the world? So just some opening remarks is from definitions. There is a difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. Now, tax avoidance is legal. This is where often high wealth individuals, corporations can legitimately avoid paying taxation. Tax evasion is illegal. So if you want to know the difference, E for evil, evasion is the bad, illegal one. But we want to try and stop both. Why is it that only powerful corporations can pay very well knowledgeable tax consultants to enable them to legally avoid paying tax on their profits? And part of the reason is in our globalized world, where these corporations are extremely powerful. Some of these corporations dominate, for example, the energy sector. So the fossil fuel sector is dominated by about 5 or 6 major corporations. They are able to move physically, but also move their money and debt across countries with ease. So they are able to identify moving their profits, for example, from high tax jurisdictions to low tax jurisdictions. And the biggest culprit in the world for this is the United Kingdom. It facilitates the vast majority of the ways in which corporations do not pay their fair share. You think about it, just put it very simply, it's very difficult for you as a worker to avoid paying your taxes. And in fact, if you don't pay your taxes, you can be fined or jailed. So a question we have to ask ourselves, why is it easier for corporations who are incredibly powerful, already incredibly wealthy, and they're able to get more wealthy and more powerful by avoiding paying the same taxes that we would have ourselves as workers? There was a big issue about how we need an international global regime. And there has been talk about this for decades, about how we need to have international regulation so that there's for example, a standard corporation tax rate. So where I am on the island of Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, it has the lowest corporation tax rate in Europe, 12.5%. Whereas in other countries, it could be 20%, 25%. And you can see how having these different corporate tax rates encourages what's called a race to the bottom, whereby corporations will tend to locate either their physical plant, their actual operations, or indeed the clearing of their profits in the lowest tax regime that they can find. And just to give you a tangible example in terms of the UK, you say, why is the UK the biggest culprit in this? It has to do with British overseas territories that you probably have heard of, the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands. These are the top places in the world that we know from empirical research where a lot of this tax evasion and avoidance goes on. But it's also then closer to home for those who are in Europe. The island of Jersey is also another major tax haven. And indeed then it's countries like the Netherlands and Switzerland. These are also then up there in the top 10 of countries that are aiding corporations not paying their fair due. So I think it's a real question that we as citizens need to demand of our governments, because it's only governments that can hold these corporations to account. They are not voluntarily going to pay their taxes, which is why we should always be skeptical about philanthropy, for example. Often we hear of super rich individuals or corporations, and they have philanthropic and parts of their organization. My view is always, we don't need your philanthropy, your charity. We want you to pay your taxes. It's a legitimate demand that we as citizens can ask of every economic entity in our society to pay their fair share. And at the moment, as Colum has outlined, the reality is that corporations are literally stealing billions. And I use that word very deliberately. They are stealing billions from often the world's poorest in terms of these corporations not being able to pay their dues to the global south. I'll finish these opening remarks by connecting it then to other issues around, this is also the legacy of imperialism, the legacy of colonization, that the same corporations that are mostly big global north corporations, so they're located in America, Canada, Europe, and so on, they operate around the world, and they are avoiding, sometimes legitimately, it's legal, but that doesn't mean to say it's moral. Something can be legal but still immoral. And I think a lot of the tax avoidance is legal but actually immoral. But then tax evasion is both immoral and illegal. That we should as citizens be angry that for these companies to pay their fair share of taxes will not reduce them to poverty. For Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or any of these super, Elon Musk, just to personify part of the problem, for them to pay extra taxation does not reduce them then, as I say, to poverty. And the reason why this is really important, both for super rich individuals like them, but also corporations, is that this economic power, this wealth, this enormous wealth that these companies have, can translate very easily into political power, where they can buy up the media, where they can promote, presidents like Berlusconi in Italy, or other, presidential candidates in other countries or political parties. Is that we need to understand that this is not just something that can be sequestered to the economy and say, oh, that's only what goes on in the economy. It actually then, the economy and politics are inextricably linked, and that these powerful corporations exert an enormous power over countries. We know historically that American corporations, aided by the CIA and American military interests, have overturned, democracies like Allende's Chile in the 1970s, in Iran in the 1950s. So again, once we begin to start talking about taxation on a global scale and looking at these global corporations, I think it shines a light on a very dark place in our contemporary world that we urgently need to fix, not least because some of these large corporations are literally betting on burning the planet. So this is fossil fuel companies who are spending millions in exploring new forms of oil and gas and coal exploration, when the science is very clear. We need to move away from these fossil fuels as quickly as possible. So what excites me around this issue of the taxation of global corporations is that it opens up a bigger conversation about what should we as citizens be demanding in terms of the structure of our economy. And I think it's a baby step, but a baby step in the right direction to begin this conversation around taxing corporations appropriately and fairly, because they operate under a social license. Corporations, like all economic entities, operate in a social license, and they are systematically abusing it currently.
Thank you so much, John. And I see that Tommaso has joined us. So I'm just going to quickly bring you in and spotlight you on this. And thanks for joining us this morning. I know Saturday is not the easiest time when you have kids and a life as well. So thanks for making the time. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Just so you know, I already introduced the event. I already introduced you. And we were just getting started with John to talk about what is the issue that we're talking about, right? How come multinationals can evade and avoid taxes? John clarified the difference between the two. And I was going to turn to you now, in addition to what John said, to kind of ask you to explain why we lack, number one, a global tax system. So my question is going to be very easy. Good luck. Why we lack a global tax system? What is that shifting? What are tax havens? And what's the link with digital profits? So the floor is yours, if you can enlighten us all. And just so you know, it's being recorded and shared on Facebook.
Okay. Thank you, Colin. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And it was a pleasure to listen to Professor Barry. I think he's outlined very well that tax avoidance as a multi-dimension from development, power, and fight against poverty, the ability of countries to raise revenue to fund the welfare state. But this is also something that is a live process. It's something that is governments keep trying to fight. As Professor Barry said, often governments are in the pocket of multinational. That makes the fight a bit more difficult. Just to give you an overview was kind of the recent last 10 years political process that have tried to put an end, or at least to mitigate the tax avoidance by multinationals. So we've been in this for about 10 years now. In 2013, the G20 tried to kickstart a process after the global financial crisis to put an end to the ability of multinational to shift profits between countries and to pay low taxes on those shifted profits. I think you mentioned that shifting. That means that a company can receive money from a subsidiary from a low tax jurisdiction. So, for example, a company in the UK can receive money from a company in Bermuda. The profits will be shifted the interest will be paid to Bermuda, and on that differential between the deduction that they will get in the UK and the profits that will be then taxed, not taxed in Bermuda, that's where your tax avoidance happens. So government finally got the political support to kickstart a process. It's what's called the base erosion profit shifting process. It was led by the OECD since 2013. And this has been a long process, initially only within OECD. I think Professor Barry mentioned that this tax avoidance actually affects developing countries a lot more than developed countries. They rely on corporate taxation much more than we do. There's countries in the global south that have 25%, so a quarter of the total revenue are based on multinationals' profits that being taxed. In the US, for example, it's like 2-3%, right? So it's a lot less. I think in the UK it's maybe 4-5%. In Italy, the same. Probably, they're probably within less than 10%. So this has got a big development angle as well. So there was a process that was started and then culminated in 2021 with two solutions. One was a minimum tax. The idea that finally multinationals should be paying at least a certain amount of tax everywhere they operate. What the agreement was, and this was agreement watered down because in that room there were tax havens represented. So you had Ireland, you had the Cayman Island, you had Switzerland, you have the other tax havens. So ultimately the agreement was 15%. 15% is a lot less than is a lot more than zero. So then in a way it was a positive step, and that was 2021. That was only possible because of a push by the Biden administration. Biden administration argued for 21%, and every percentage point is almost tens of billions extra additional revenue. So to a 15%, the estimated additional revenue, if all countries introduce a 15% minimum tax, will be about 200 billion. ACRIT, the commission where I'm there, the Secretariat, and is chaired by Joseph Stiglitz and Jayati Ghosh, their view was that, or our view was that to be 25%. With 25%, you will have 500 billion additional revenue. Ultimately, the agreement at the OECD was 15%. Now the EU has started legislating for it, and it will be effective from 1st of January 2024. Even the EU, because the EU within these members has a number of tax havens, Ireland, but not just Ireland, there's Malta, there's Luxembourg, the Netherlands, the Cyprus, they have, there is a unanimity to decide, there is a unanimity, it needs to be done through unanimity. So any country can veto any legislative proposal on tax matters. So ultimately, Hungary, Poland put up a fight, but ultimately it was overturned, not because they care about taxing multinational fairly, but because they care about the kind of the next generation funds, so the funds that were coming for EU post-pandemic. And that shows how some of the politics are actually trying to win, advance these negotiations, advance reform. So that was a big moment, because if without the EU is kind of the third largest economic bloc after China and the US. So, it was important that these countries are now going to implement this. So this is one part of the solution. The other part of the solution was called Pillar 1. And Pillar 1 is basically what dealt with profit shifting or it's meant to deal with profit shifting by digital companies. So digital companies like Google, Amazon, Netflix, Facebook were basically able to book their profits not where the customer is resident, but in a low tax jurisdiction. So you're able to change, and that was allowed by the rule, as Professor Barry said. This was legal, potentially unethical, in my view unethical, but it was definitely mostly legal. And to stop this, then the rules needed to be changed, and that requires countries to change the way taxing rights over multinational profits are negotiated. And so there was very small agreement, so that a small percentage of the global profits of the largest multinationals, so Facebook multinational, a small amount now will be by a formula allocated to where the customer reside, which means that because it's through a formula, once you have a formula, you can't really game the system that much, because the formula is there, everybody can see how the formula is calculated, and the formula is set. And that is what has been agreed. However, most of these new profits come from the US. And the US current politics, the Yellen administration has been driving this agreement to try and get a global agreement. So it's been a very active. But now the politics in the US means that to actually be ratify this agreement, it requires support by both Congress, the Senate, and the other chamber, and the current Biden administration doesn't control both chambers. So this looks like it's still going to be difficult. And furthermore, this has not been well received by countries in the global south. This more relocation means they will get little. It means that this deal, as we have today, is still seen as unequal, particularly by developing countries. So much so that in last year at the UN, the African group of countries tabled a resolution that was opposed by the US initially to actually kickstart a new round of negotiation at the UN. And this is happening in the coming months. So the Secretary General has written a report outlining 3 different options to go forward at the UN. And this is also about power shifting, and because the OECD, ultimately the OECD is the group of countries, rich countries, US, G7 countries, most European countries belong to the OECD. They are those that have set the rules at the start of last century. But the world has changed, and it's changing rapidly. We're seeing there are, this new momentum at the BRICS. So in terms of how these geopolitical negotiations can pan out, a lot depends of multiple factors, including multiple negotiation. There's the negotiation on debt that's really important for developing countries, but taxes is seen as a key one to be able to actually reduce the reliance on aid from the global north and actually being able to increase domestic resources and to meet the development goals and to actually give themselves fiscal space.
Thank you so much, Tommaso. So let me try to link some of the things that John and you have mentioned along with the questions from the participants that I'm receiving. So we define the issues of the fact that we lack a global tax system, and the fact that clearly certain companies are using it, that some countries are benefiting from the situation and refusing to take actions. And then we also talked a bit about global north versus global south, how the OECD has been leading the charge you mentioned, and Tommaso actually sent me an article this week as well on how the UN is responding to this, saying the solutions need to be more inclusive. We received a question on Facebook that I want to ask the both of you, from Mohammed from Pakistan, saying, okay, the OECD's proposal might be going forward. It seems like some countries will not be able to implement it. What are the next steps? What do you think is actually feasible, or what should be done now today in order to be able to create a global tax system, and if not a global tax system, a system where multinationals don't evade and avoid taxes? What are the feasible steps we should be pushing for? Maybe John, you can start, and then Tommaso complement.
Yeah, no, this is a really good question. And I'm afraid there's no easy answer, because this is a global issue. We have over 190 sovereign nation states on the planet. It's almost equivalent. Look at the difficulties of getting climate change negotiations agreed by all of these countries, some of whom have vested interest in keeping the current tax regime. And Tommaso has already mentioned, sadly, my own country, Ireland, is disgracefully, part of the problem here, in which almost 28% of the entire Irish tax revenue comes from the corporate sector. And in that way, it's an outlier in the European context. So it has almost the structure of a developing world country. And therefore, Ireland, for example, is not really that supportive of shifting corporation tax rates up. So the issue here is, how do we negotiate international agreements between states? And it is good. I mean, I wouldn't be particularly a fan of American power and Biden, but at least there has been a move, largely not being done, it must be said. Any move towards regularizing and having a global tax base is not often been done out of humanitarian reasons, so that more tax revenue can flow to the global south, or that we need more equity between the taxes paid by labor and by capital. It has to do more with a business logic around a level playing field in terms of competition between countries for attracting multinationals. And of course, that goes without saying, but I'll just emphasize it. Part of the reason why countries like Ireland, or some of the countries in Eastern Europe like Estonia and so on, want to have lower corporation tax is that this acts as a way to incentivize the location of these corporations in those societies. Now, to me, that's a rational decision, even though I think it's very foolhardy. Because just to go back to something you said, Colum, in terms of Amazon, these companies are not just avoiding and evading paying taxes, they also pay their workers very poorly. They often don't recognize collective bargaining and trade unions. And they're also what's called footloose capital. And what I mean by that is that often these corporations do not integrate into the regional or national economy, which means they can quickly just leave if the corporate tax regime changes. And this has happened in Ireland, and certainly Northern Ireland, where I am, where large employers have decided to move away and then leaving unemployment and devastation in their wake. So again, it's that issue that let's not just focus on the taxation regime, important as it is, but actually to begin to see that there's much bigger problems with the corporate domination of our global economy. But it does require international agreement, and you'd like to think, whether it's the OECD or the European Union, a kind of a regional bloc, not of all countries, but a sufficiently set of powerful countries, can begin that initiative of having a global tax regime. But I could see how it is very, very difficult to do that. And that's why ultimately we have to have citizen power. We have to have, in the same way that the climate movement now is generating more and more people involved in demanding greater climate action by our governments and international agreements, we are going to need that citizen power as well to demand of our states to come together to regulate these corporations, because the only power on this planet that can regulate these corporations is the state, and states coming together to create international binding agreements.
Tommaso, do you want to add something to this or answer to it?
We'll add 3 points. First, we need to remember that another world is possible. So there was a world 40 years ago when the average corporate tax rate was in kind of mid-40. Now is just about 20%. So just this is kind of actual nominal rates, so not even effective rates. But there's been a significant drop. So it's a so-called race to the bottom in corporate tax rate. That was part of the idea of the ideology of trickle-down economics. You cut taxes on businesses, business will invest. That's not worked out. We've seen stagnant wages, and we've seen low growth and an increase in inequality. So I think we need to think that actually what we're trying to achieve is possible. It's happened before. It's not like we're kind of dreaming that multinational could be taxed fairly. There was a world when multinational were taxed fairly, and so this can change. It requires a lot of work. The second point is that change requires countries to be willing to work together, but also to sometimes go unilaterally. It was interesting to see that now we do have a minimum tax, and I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance to actually the principle that there should be a minimum taxation of multinationals. So all multinationals should pay at least a minimum amount. That means we normalize the fact that having zero taxation is ethically not acceptable. And that means that as a group of countries, the world has broadly agreed that a minimum tax is a good thing. That's a fight that we won in terms of normalizing the issue. Now, it's too low. So the question is, okay, how do we raise this? And then how do we get towards a better, that basically create a floor that reduces the incentive to shift profits to low tax jurisdiction, because if you're going to pay anyway taxes, even if you put profit in tax haven, the incentive is reduced. Now, if the UK has 25% tax rate now, corporate tax rate, and the minimum tax is 15%, the incentive is much better than when it was 0 to 25%, but 15% to 25 is still a big gap. We need to raise that to 21, 25%, and that will allow also to increase top rates. And if we just look at the politics, Biden's manifesto is to actually keep on increasing to 28% the corporate tax rate, scaling in 21, and to raise the minimum tax to 21%. If the US moves, then all countries will just adjust upwards. Okay, so that's one fight that we can try and win. The other is about how do we move towards a different way to tax multinationals. That means how profits are allocated between countries. So the digital multinational can no longer pull profits in low tax jurisdiction. That requires countries to sometimes move unilaterally. The only reason why we have this process at the OECD is because countries start introducing digital service taxes, and each country putting pressure on the US to actually say, well, if you keep avoiding taxation, we're going to figure out a way to actually tax you. And businesses don't like multiple taxes. They rather have one tax, so there is an advantage actually having a system that works. And the European Union is, for a number of, since 2011, they tried to create a new system based on a formula. So that you take the profits in European Union and you allocate them between member states using a formula. That will completely change the system that we have today that allows tax avoidance. It's been blocked, but the European Commission will put forward a proposal in the coming months. And then you have the UN process. That UN process, if it starts, then it provides an opportunity for further discussion. You know, the system has been evolving for the last century. It was created when there were no digital multinational, when kind of the global world, the world was not integrated. And so to be able, you know, we live in a different world now. And we see that basically the current system is no longer fit for this economy. So I think, you know, it's almost by default that there will be a change. The question is how fast we can move, and bear in mind that there are forces that enjoy this, you know, they want the status quo, because the status quo allow low effective tax rates. That means more profits for shareholders. That means more profit for CEOs, and more rewards for CEOs, high shareholder prices. So there's a big incentive by the lobby of multinationals to keep the status quo. So that's, you know, for the movements can help for a fight against these forces.
Thank you. I really like the start by saying that, you know, it has been done, so it can be done. And often a lot of those battles seem unsurmountable. It seems like, you know, it's impossible to change the status quo. But indeed, taxation was higher, so it's possible to bring it back. And we are running out of time, and I received like 20 questions. So I'm going to try to summarize them into 2 questions, one for each of you. And I'm sorry, everyone, if we can't answer to all of your questions. I'm sure you can tweet at both John and Tommaso or send follow-up emails. But I'm going to try to summarize it. John, you touched a bit on the ethical aspects of, or the lack of ethical aspects of avoiding taxes. So without talking about illegal practices, I want to focus 2 seconds on the moral one. So obviously, you know, while it's legal to avoid your taxes, I think we both agree, well, not everyone will agree here, that it's just insane to do so when it won't make you poor, unable to operate, or anything else. I'm going to link this to a question I received from, I'm trying to find it again, from someone from New York who said, how come Amazon can negotiate tax discounts with American states and cities without the federal government stepping in or something else? So clearly we see both that some companies are acting in what I would describe as immoral ways in avoiding the taxes. My question is thus twofold. Do you think that there's something that either consumers or shareholders should be doing to pressure those companies, so looking outside of the purely legal aspect, but to pressure those companies into behaving in a more ethical way? And do you think that government entities should be, we're trying to find a way to phrase this, do you think that government entities should be even considering discussions with multinationals that are negotiating for a better deal in some places on earth, or is it just immoral on those government entities to do so? Sorry, I know it's a lot of questions, but I'm trying to not ignore anyone who's been following the live stream.
No, this is a great question, and it actually connects in a way to another question in the chat about why does the EU allow these tax havens? And in many respects, people tend to forget that America is a federal system, so there's a national government, but the individual states in America have an awful lot of autonomy economically, different tax regimes, sales taxes, and that's what allows Amazon to negotiate the state of Utah versus Minnesota. in the same way that within the EU, Ireland is trying to attract with its low corporation tax rate, companies to relocate from Germany and so on. It's because effectively both the United States and the European Union are pro-free market. I would even go so far as to say they're ideologically neoliberal in terms of wanting to encourage this form of globally integrated, competitive companies crossing either state borders in America or indeed national borders in the EU and beyond. And then we're back to the issue of, well, what do we do about this? Certainly I think consumers, and we've seen this in the past, where they can engage in boycotts, for example. So there is an anti-Amazon, not necessarily around it not paying its taxes, but more because of its poor labor rights and not recognizing trade unions and so on. So consumers can decide where to put their money, and in a way to divest individually from supporting a particular company. I think those individual consumer acts are necessary, perhaps, but insufficient. We need a political and structural change, not individual consumers making that decision, but the state to come in and to regulate companies in greater force. There is a particular role, though, for shareholders. They're the people who are being served most by the corporation, and it has to do again with the structure legally of a corporation. There's a fiduciary duty. So there's a legal obligation on behalf of the corporate executive officer or the corporate financial officer to maximize profits for shareholders. And part of the problem again here is a structural issue with the nature of contemporary capitalism, in that shareholder value is measured by every quarter. So every 3 months is the regulation or the expectation of shareholder profits increasing. Now, that short-term time frame is completely out of sync with many of the things that we're talking about here today. So there, in my view, we need states to restructure the legal way in which corporations actually operate. So this has gone way beyond simply taxing them fairly, but actually there's a problem at the very heart of the structure of how corporations actually operate. And so I do think the last thing I would say is that there is an opportunity, particularly with a lot of corporations now adopting what's called ESG, that's, environment, social governance, ethical commitments to be good citizens. Many of these corporations, like big organizations around the world now, are adopting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They're saying we support this. And a lot of it is greenwashing and whitewashing. So I think corporations have made a potential rod for their own back, in terms of it enables activist organizations and citizens to call out the hypocrisy. How can a company be claiming to support the UN SDGs, which are there to help the world's poor and most vulnerable to develop in a dignified way, while at the same time engaging in tax avoidance and avoidance? So there's an opportunity there strategically, I think, for those of us who want corporations to be taxed fairly, to use their greenwashing or whitewashing efforts in terms of embracing, this ESG agenda or the UN SDGs as a way of pointing out their hypocrisy. And certainly one thing that all corporations are very concerned about is their media reputation. And it is something that I think activists have exploited very successfully in past campaigns to get companies to do the right thing.
Thank you, John. I think the audience is definitely agreeing with you, and I think there's a lot of points to chew on. I agree that it goes beyond simple taxation, and we're thinking about the way we do business, think about business, and the purpose of business. Tommaso, I'm going to close with you, and I'm again going to ask you not so simple questions, trying to link a few different things. So you mentioned the OECD process, the UN one, the EU Commission and EU Council processes, and so on. And obviously, there's a lot of shortcomings with all of those, from rules of unanimity to the realities of politics when a government doesn't control both chambers and so on. What at Atlas, we're trying to think about in which ways we could actually impact such processes, whether through advocacy campaigns, electoral ones, and so on, in the most efficient way. In your own opinion, which one of those processes is the most promising one, taking into consideration the fact that, as you mentioned, the world is extremely rapidly evolving, that a lot of those institutions have drastically and completely ignored parts of the world and not taken them into, not allowed them to have a space to express their voice. I saw a few questions and comments from people from Kenya, for example, saying, how come my country is not being represented in those discussions? And how come I don't have a voice on this? So which process would you focus on if you were us? And which one do you believe has the most potential to create a bit of a more fair system?
My sense is that you need to base your decision on understanding the politics of the process and which countries are leading the process and which countries are required to get on board to actually make the process a success. So the process of the UN, this is a live new process that will start this autumn. And this means that, and this is pushed by countries in the Global South. Now, the Global South is trying to find a way to work in unity, to find coalition of governments across both Africa and Latin America in particular, to work together. And you have a dispersed group of activists across global coverage. And that means that this process can be a useful way to raise attention on this issue. At the EU, I think the EU is the current politics of the EU are broadly problematic, as you can imagine. We have, if you look at the recent electoral cycles, so the chances of advancing in the EU in the next 5 years, based on the current polls and what the European Parliament will look like and the European Commission will look like next year, might make that process a bit more complex. Having said that, it's important that to have the UN, all countries are represented, and countries that will want to block this process are rich countries, the US, the UK, perhaps France, Germany. Those countries that have, as I said before, as I've mentioned, also the benefit from some aspects of the current process. So you have a movement that is present is also in developed countries, in rich countries, and so the UN provides the opportunity for support a process that is happening that will affect all countries in the world and where all countries are involved.
Thank you so much, Tommaso. So you got it, everyone. Follow the UN process right now, and we'll talk more in the next hour that we have together about this. I wanted to give a big round of applause to John and Tommaso for their contribution. Thank you so much for joining us on a Saturday. I know it's not always the easiest, but